Hi guys, and welcome back to Best of Birth Worlds. My name is Kayla and I'm your host today. We're going to be talking about birth trauma, which is something that I'm very, very, very passionate about. Not only have I experienced it myself, but also I've seen other people experience it. And I've heard other people's stories. And I wanted to talk about birth trauma today. It is very important that we have these discussions and be able to openly discuss what birth trauma is and what leads to birth trauma, and you would be surprised. It's not always this stuff. Sometimes it's things completely out of our control, and that's very unfortunate. The one thing that I wish a lot of people knew is that birth trauma doesn't discriminate. Birth trauma is not very picky about who it chooses to bestow upon itself. It doesn't care. It really doesn't care. It doesn't care if you've had a C-section. It doesn't care if you've had a vaginal birth. It doesn't care if you had a hospital birth. It doesn't care if you had a home birth. It doesn't care what your birth plan was. It doesn't care if you went unmedicated or had an epidural. It doesn't care. Quite frankly, like, birth trauma doesn't care. And that's one thing that I wish a lot of people knew, is that birth trauma can happen to anyone, and it does happen to anyone. I experienced birth trauma with my last baby. That birth, while everything went according to plan, according to my birth plan, I had written out a birth plan that said I want to go unmedicated, I want minimal cervical checks, I want intermittent fetal monitoring, I want to be listened to, all of these things, like I wanted to be able to get into different positions, I wanted to be able to use water, I wanted to be able to do all of these things. And if you had like a checklist, you would go check, 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 check. But that's not how birth trauma works, because unfortunately, I also, upon everything else that I also got that I wanted, I also received birth trauma. And that birth trauma didn't come from me not getting an epidural like I wanted. It didn't come from me getting anything that I wanted on my birth plan, but birth can sometimes just be very tricky and not be something that you can really plan. With every single one of my doula clients I take on, I make them have a birth plan. Birth plans are so extremely, extremely important. Along with that birth plan, I first of all let them know that, like, they have the power. They have the control over their own body. Like, they have that power. Not anyone else. Like, no one else can take that away from you. And so that's like one thing that I really try to instill in people when they make a birth plan, is like, this is powerful, This isn't going to be things about fear. You can have fears and you can talk about those fears, but putting them in your birth plan, it's more likely to happen. But once we make that birth plan, I also have a conversation with my clients that it's like, okay, this is a birth preference list. Like, birth can't be planned. And so I sit down and have a conversation and be like, these things, I'm going to try to get you as close to these things as possible. And I like birth plans because it also lets everyone be on the same page. That is why I don't condemn birth plans as a doula. They can be a very great tool to have while you're in labor, especially if you're in active or transition and you have a new nurse. If they have a shift change or anything like that, you can just hand this out to them and be like, here you go. Get away from me. Don't talk to me. I don't want to talk about my birth plan right now. Just let me be in my own little birth world. And that's a great thing about birth plans, is that, like, every single person can be on the same page with every single point that you want to have. And I know a lot of labor and delivery nurses just hate birth plans because they're like, oh, they're just so complicated. They're truly not that complicated. Like, a lot of people will put on their birth plans most simple stuff, like, I want the epidural. I want to be listened to. I want continuous or intermittent fetal monitoring. I want minimal checks. Like, those are so simple things that can be done, and yet so many people just crap on birth plans, and I truly just don't get it. I don't get the stigma, I guess, around birth plans. And it can be a very, very awesome thing to have a birth plan and to be able to have that for every single person on your team. So now back onto birth trauma. You can write that birth plan. You can have everything according to plan, and it just doesn't go to plan. And that is okay. And I feel like it's very important to say that that's okay, because that's one thing that I wish someone had told me after I went through birth trauma was it's okay that it didn't go to plan. I beat myself up for so long because I experienced birth trauma. Like, that was the hardest thing I have ever experienced in my life. It was hard, you know. When you have this dream birth, like I had 2 previous epidural births, and I wanted that unmedicated birth. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, why would you ever want to feel that? I've gotten that comment so much on social media. Like, why would you ever want to feel that? And the true, honest answer is that I wanted to be able to experience that once in my life. With my other 2 babies, I would go to the hospital, I would get checked in, I would have contractions for a few hours, I would ask for the epidural, I would get the epidural, and I would feel no more pain. I wouldn't have to go through transition, I wouldn't have to feel the fetal ejection reflex, like all of these things that I never got to feel with my epidural births. And that's what I wanted to experience with my unmedicated birth, was being able to experience all of the things that come along with an unmedicated birth, you know, like the fetal ejection reflex, like that was the coolest experience I have ever experienced. That was just so awesome to be able to experience that. And nowadays, with the epidural and medications being so readily available and not many people wanting to feel that, like I get it. I didn't want to feel that either with my first 2 births. And I didn't even think that I would have a 3rd baby. And so when I got pregnant with my 3rd baby unexpectedly, I was like, this is what I want. This is what I want. I remember that line popping up and immediately going, this is my dream birth. In fact, the day I found out I was pregnant, that night, a girl that I follow went live on Instagram. She went live on Instagram and showed her home birth. And it was just like so beautiful. It was like 2 worlds intertwining, like me finding out I was pregnant and then also her giving birth at the same time. And I was like, that's what I want. That's what I want, but in a hospital. I knew that I wouldn't be able to have a home birth. First of all, it's just not readily available. Like, the access to home births is just not great. Truly, it's just not great. A lot of insurances won't pay for it, so we have to pay it out of pocket. I had Medicaid at the time, so I wasn't paying for insurance at all. And yeah, I would have had to pay completely out of pocket for a home birth, and I didn't want to do that. And I'm actually really glad that I didn't, because of what came afterwards. I had a postpartum hemorrhage. It had to be stopped with both Pitocin and my nurse doing a fundal massage. That's what stopped me from hemorrhaging. I hemorrhaged for over 2 minutes. That was part of my birth trauma, because it's scary. It's scary because you know that you're bleeding out. Like, in that moment when they are pressing on your uterus so firmly, it feels like you are kneading really hard dough. That's what it's like, is when the dough is just like really, really, really hard. And so you have to like knead it really, really hard. And that's what my nurse was doing. And I honestly thank her for it. Like, she saved my life. But in the middle of my fundal massage, they had to stop and assess the bleeding. And after they assessed, they were like, okay, you're still not stopping bleeding. And so they had to do it again. And the stopping and the starting, oh my gosh. I thought it was painful the first time that they did the fundal massage. No. That second round, when they realized that I was still profusely bleeding, that was terrifying. First of all, like, I got even more scared, because I'm like, why am I not stopping bleeding? But also, that was so painful, having to have that little bit of a break and then go into it really deeply again. And like, that to me was the worst part. So now on to a little bit more of what my birth trauma entailed. I got into the bath, got out of the bath. I was in transition. I was 9 centimeters dilated. I got out of the bath, felt like I had to push. So I got back on the bed and I started pushing, and I pushed so hard that my cervix came out of me. I have a uterine prolapse, so like this is not anything new. My uterine prolapse is actually from my first delivery. Get that postpartum physical therapy, pelvic floor therapy. I highly recommend it. It is amazing. I wish that I had done it, because now I have a uterine prolapse where my uterus just like likes to say hello every now and then. But I pushed my cervix out of me, and that is when my midwife had realized that I wasn't fully dilated. I had what is called a cervical lip. So it's essentially where your cervix is fully dilated, but on one side, and it's mostly dependent on the baby's head. The baby's head can be pressing on one side harder than the others, and that's what happens is it causes a cervical lip on one side where the baby's head is not pressing as hard, and not like your baby's head is just like not in the primal place to be. So I was essentially pushing against my cervix, and that hurt so badly, and I had no idea that like that pain wasn't normal. And so we got into different positions. So I got me on my hands and knees, and then we did side lying, and I was like, why am I not able to push my baby out? And that's when we realized that I had a cervical lip. Sometimes you can actually push that lip out of the way and then you can birth your baby, but for me it was just not working, and so we decided to wait just a little bit longer. I think I waited for about 15 or so minutes. I got back on my hands and knees, and after about 5 minutes on my hands and knees I felt the need to push again, and that's when I birthed my baby. But that cervical lip is what caused a lot of birth trauma for me. I didn't even know what that was. I wasn't a birth doula at the time. This was 2 years ago. I had no clue what I was feeling, and I thought like, oh, this is normal pushing pain. No, if you are feeling extreme amounts of pain in your cervix, that's not normal. And I wish someone would have said, hey, this is not normal, and had just like stopped me. I don't know. That part for me was very traumatizing because I was just in so much pain. The contractions were so painful. And then on top of that, the cervical pain that I was having from that lip. And that was so extremely hard to be able to be like, okay, this is not normal. What am I doing? I don't know what to do. It was extremely hard. And then I gave birth to my baby, and about 10 minutes later I had that postpartum hemorrhage, and that was one of the hardest things I had ever gone through. It was traumatizing to not know what's going on, why your uterus won't stop bleeding. Postpartum hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of the maternal mortality rate in the US. And I had already known this going into birth because I had done so much research on birth. Like, I've been obsessed with birth for forever, honestly. Ever since I gave birth to my first baby almost 7 years ago, I have just been like fascinated with birth. And I knew going into it, postpartum hemorrhage was the leading cause of death. And that's terrifying to think about, to be honest with you. And knowing that like you can bleed out within the matter of minutes. You can die within the matter of minutes. That is terrifying. A lot of people ask me, hey, did you have an IV? And yes, I had a hep lock, which is essentially just where they place the IV, but nothing is attached to it. And I got that for emergencies, and I'm really, really glad I did. There's been a lot of people that are like, oh, I'm going to refuse the IV. I'm just going to refuse it altogether. And if you were my sister, I would tell you, I wouldn't do that. what I experienced with them placing the IV is nothing compared to the fear and the terror and the pain that I felt while going through a postpartum hemorrhage. And knowing that, like, I could have bled out at any minute, like, completely dead. That's terrifying. And it's terrifying to think that your life was on the line and that you couldn't be here for your babies anymore. Whew, I'm going to take a minute. It's scary to think about death. And now that I am a mom, I've been a mom for almost 7 years, I think constantly about dying and leaving my kids, and the thought of it just, I can't bear it. I can't bear it. I can't bear to leave my kids here alone without a mom. And the fact that I was having a hemorrhage that wasn't stopping, and like, I constantly think about that, like, what would have happened if it didn't stop? You know, I'm just so grateful that I had an IV. They were able to hook me up to Pitocin. They actually hooked me up to Pitocin right after I delivered. And that's for preventative care. They give you Pitocin so that your uterus can clamp down. Because I went so fast, actually the number one leading cause of a postpartum hemorrhage is uterine atony. And what can cause that is just your uterus being really, really tired. Your uterus goes, I've done my job, I'm done. It's very dramatic, okay? Your uterus can be very, very dramatic and not know what to do in that moment. And so that's essentially what happened. I went from 6 centimeters to 9 centimeters within the matter of 8 minutes. And I had contractions, one on top of the other, like every few minutes. Even ones that were back to back, like a contraction would go down and then it would immediately go back up. So I would have back to back contractions over the next hour, and my uterus was just tired. And that's essentially what causes uterine atony, which is what causes postpartum hemorrhage. And that was hard for me to be able to be like, oh my gosh, what did I just do? I have been asked over on my social medias what I did to actually get over my birth trauma, to actually cope with it. And honestly, it was time. I remember I was about 2 weeks postpartum, and how I had given birth was on my hands and knees on the back of the hospital bed. And I was on my hands and knees 2 weeks postpartum in my house, on the back of my couch, just looking out the window. And I had a flashback, a PTSD flashback. I went back into that moment and I could hear my screams. That was really, really hard for me, to be able to hear my screams and not be able to comfort myself, I guess. That was hard, and my heart started racing. I immediately got off the couch to just shake it off, and I had a panic attack. That panic attack lasted about 20 or so minutes. I was not able to stamp myself out of it, and that was the hardest thing that I have ever gone through. I remember being a few hours postpartum, and I had taken a bath in the hospital. And I remember sitting in the tub with the water running over me because I couldn't stand because of my blood loss. And I remember just being like, oh my God, what just happened? That was the first time that I had realized like how traumatic my birth was, and that, oh no, I have a lot of work to do now. I've got a lot of work to do now. I had already had PTSD before I had been diagnosed with PTSD, depression and anxiety, all that kind of stuff. And so now I'm like, oh no, I have to do the work again. But honestly, time is what it took. For the first year, I wasn't able to listen to any birth stories, even good ones. Because even the good ones, they would cause me to be envious. I would be very jealous and envious, and like, it's not that I wanted anyone else to go through the birth trauma, it's that I didn't want to go through that birth trauma, and that I wish I didn't go through that birth trauma. And that was like very hard for me to be able to cope with like all of these feelings. It was very hard for me. So the first year postpartum, I couldn't listen to any birth stories. I couldn't hear any birth stories. That was simply the hardest part for me. And like, I don't know how I got through it. It was just time. Time is what it took. I remember being able to listen to my first birth story without having my heart race. Like, my heart would race every single time people would talk about birth, and which is very ironic because I was about 3 or 4 months postpartum when I started posting my birth online, and that's actually where I became viral at, is from my birth online. And I started talking about my birth trauma, and little by little I started opening up more about my birth trauma and realizing that like, I'm not alone. Sharing my birth story and my birth trauma specifically has helped a lot of people. And I've gotten so many comments and so many DMs from people being like, your story has helped me, or your story has helped me cope, your story has helped me in any other way. And it feels so good knowing that like, my birth trauma wasn't for nothing. My birth trauma had meaning behind it. If I'm able to help one single person, then I have done what I've set out to do. And that feels amazing that I'm able to do this, and to be able to post online about all of my struggles and all the things that I've gone through. And it feels incredible being able to be that person, I guess. So I think this is what I'm going to leave you with today, is that birth trauma doesn't have to be the end of you. It doesn't have to be your whole story. It can be one single part of you. And I promise you it does get better, because now I'm almost 2 years postpartum. I'll be 2 years postpartum in July, the first week of July. And that is just, it's bizarre to me that like it's already been 2 years, but also I'm so proud of like all the healing that I've done. I can listen to birth stories now. I can talk to people about birth now. I can listen to good birth stories without feeling envious. I am so happy that people have really good birth stories. And I just also want people to know that like, they're not alone if they don't. You're not alone if you didn't have a good birth story. If you didn't have a good birth, it is okay. And I am here. My social medias have been a part of me, and a part where I can tell my story, and in turn other people have been able to tell me their story, and like, that just feels amazing. It feels amazing that I'm able to do this for other people, and that I'm able to share my story and have it have meaning again, and not just be something that went terribly wrong. And so that is what I'm leaving you with here today, is that birth trauma is very, 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 very hard. And I am so sorry to every single person who has experienced birth trauma in any single capacity. You know, I've had a lot of people be like, oh, what you experienced was not traumatic. And I just want to say, like, you don't get to talk about, you don't get to distinguish, I guess, what someone else finds traumatic. What's traumatic for them might not be traumatic for you, and what's traumatic for you is not traumatic to them. But the only person that gets to determine if someone has birth trauma is the person that went through that specific birth. And that is the only person that gets to say who had birth trauma and who didn't. It's hard being able to have birth trauma and then also have people on top of that being like, ugh, that wasn't traumatic. I've had that happen, be like, ugh, that was not traumatic. I told my birth story about 2 weeks postpartum, maybe even 3 weeks postpartum. I posted a couple videos online, and the backlash I received being like, this was a traumatic birth, and people being like, I have a worse story. Let's not compare traumas. That does nothing to anyone. It does nothing to anyone. In fact, it just makes you look like an ass. So But that is my birth trauma. And if you guys want to send me a DM over on Instagram, send me a comment on any of my other social media platforms, I will have all of those linked over on my IG. So it is Kayla Natalie Doula. And I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. And just know that you are not alone. I am your local neighborhood doula at your cervix, and I am signing out. Bye, guys.